entered Lhasa. That summer, an agreement was reached and the Dalai Lama returned. For the next few years, life was to continue outwardly much the same as it always had, dominated by religion and the yearly cycle of ceremonies considered vital to the well-being of the country. The treaty concluded between Tibet and China was the first for over 1,000 years. The Tibetans had no choice but to sign. The country's future role was defined as being part of the Chinese motherland. In return, the agreement appeared to pledge no change in the status and powers of the Dalai Lama and promised protection for the Tibetan religion. At first, the Chinese were not much in evidence, but within a year, there were several thousand in Lhasa. Food and fuel became scarce. Relations between Chinese and Tibetans deteriorated. In 1954, the Dalai Lama was invited on a long visit to Peking. The journey to China was filmed by Jigme Taring, a Tibetan official whose wife, Mary La, tells the story.
Had come to see the Dalai Lama off. On the banks of the Kichu River, hundreds of people burnt incense to wish His Holiness a safe journey. They were afraid he might never be allowed to return. We crossed the river in yak hide boats, tied together, and the people watching did their best to cheer up. But they were very sad to see His Holiness go. The Chinese said that this visit to Peking would help the Dalai Lama by widening his knowledge. Monks and about 100 officials were also invited. They had to take their own ponies and tents and servants. It was very lovely on the road. As we went southeast, it was thickly wooded, with tall pine trees, rather like Scotland. Though the countryside was very beautiful, there was not a very happy atmosphere. It was here that we heard that the whole town of Gyantse had been washed away in a terrible flood that drowned more than 2,000 people, including many of our friends. After 12 days, the way became very dangerous as the Chinese were taking us along the unfinished road they were building for motor vehicles. We had to walk for hours. The mud was about 9 inches deep. This region is so wet that often rain washed away the new road, and once a bridge was damaged. The Chinese soldiers repaired it with logs. We had begun to meet a lot of Chinese soldiers on the journey. It seemed to be very good. Several Chinese that I had met in Lhasa were supervising the road building. They came to see us, to wish us a happy journey. They said we should take an interest in learning political science and join the Chinese. Then we would be much safer in the future. After 24 days traveling, which we organized ourselves, the Chinese met us in Timor, in Poyo, which is still in Tibet. In Peking, the Chinese looked after us very well. Everyone was hoping that relations would improve. We were taken to see factories and ancient places, while our officials had to attend endless meetings with the Chinese. They were having talks about setting up the preparatory committee for the autonomous region of Tibet, as our country was now to be known. All our officials who were concerned looked worried and tired. But things seemed to go quite well. After 5 months in Peking, we started our return journey to Lhasa through eastern Tibet. His Holiness visited many monasteries and gave sermons at each important town. Thousands came from far away to greet him. The people showed him much faith and love and were so happy they threw themselves towards him. By now, the new motor road to Lhasa had been completed, and the journey that had taken 24 days a year earlier could now be done in a week. Huge crowds gathered to see His Holiness at all the stopping places along the way. In Lhasa, everyone turned out to welcome His Holiness back. They had feared that the Chinese might not allow him to come home. There were now many more Chinese in Lhasa. They had built a bridge across the Kichu River. After going to the cathedral to give thanks for his safe return, His Holiness was escorted to the noble Inca, his summer palace.
In Peking, there had been many speeches about the great friendship between Tibetans and Chinese, but there was no great friendship. At home, the people kept quiet, because the Dalai Lama was like a hostage in Peking. But after his return, fighting broke out in eastern Tibet. Attacks on their religion had inflamed the people. The Chinese tried to be conciliatory, but Tibetan resistance grew. In 1958, a Chinese military post was annihilated within 25 miles of Lhasa. It was clear that a serious explosion was in the making. Religion was at the very heart of Tibet. A third of the male population of Tibet were monks. Monks held most of the senior administrative posts, jointly with lay officials. The senior member of the Tibetan cabinet was a monk. Everything in Tibet was subordinate to religion. The Dalai Lama himself was a god incarnate. Senior members of the Tibetan government accompanied the Dalai Lama to the ceremonies. Cabinet meetings were held at the monasteries throughout the 3 months of the examinations. In all my years in Tibet, wrote Heinrich Harrer, I never met anyone who expressed the slightest doubt about Lord Buddha's teachings. Shortly after the successful completion of his examination, early in March 1959, the Dalai Lama was invited to attend a display at the Chinese barracks in Lhasa. To the Tibetans, this was seen as a trap. They believed that the Chinese would seize the Dalai Lama. Thousands swarmed to the noble Inca summer palace to protect him. It was the beginning of an uprising against the Chinese. A Chinese emissary was stoned to death. Campers from eastern Tibet took up defensive positions and were soon joined by Tibetan soldiers. The Tibetan people had taken matters into their own hands. Unknown to the Chinese, the Dalai Lama had slipped away from Lhasa by night. The last Tibetan cabinet meeting had denounced all agreements with China on the grounds of persistent violations by China and had proclaimed Tibet independent.
Their patience finally exhausted, the military area command called an emergency meeting 7 hours after the outbreak of the revolt. They resolved to resolutely suppress the rebellion and safeguard the unity and territorial integrity of the motherland.